Mitt Romney, had earned his fortunes in that field. Private equity can be a cruel business, and Romney received a lot of criticism for some of his conduct over the years. And we invited Professor Damodaran to shed light both on how private equity works, but also on its moral dimension. Were the Democrats right to cast Romney in such a negative light? Turns out he wasn't such a bad guy. We've invited the professor back to talk about ESG because here, too, it's worth examining this phenomenon from both a practical and moral angle. We all want companies to act in ways that benefit all of society, especially in terms of the environment, climate change, and the social consequences of their actions. But is ESG really the best way to get us there? Further, is support of ESG a moral imperative? Are those who oppose ESG bad people? I'm sure that many in the audience will disagree with much that he has to say, and I know that he will be delighted to field questions from the audience. We have 2 microphones lined up. Please simply stand near the microphone, make an orderly line, and ask a short and concise question, and I guarantee that we will have an engaging discussion. So please welcome Professor Aswath Damodaran to discuss the difficult truth about ESG.
On the question part, I'm going to make things a little easier because walking up to a mic is an act that sometimes scares people. You don't want to get there. It takes a while. So why don't you ask me the questions from where you're sitting, and I'll just repeat the question. That way we'll save ourselves the traveling time to the mic to ask questions. I mean, I'm a teacher, and the last thing I would want in a classroom is for students to stream up to a mic. And that's a good place to start this class. I'm a teacher. I describe myself as a teacher. I'm not a professor. That sounds so incredibly pompous and pedantic. Introduce myself. I'm Professor so-and-so. Okay. I'm not an academic. The word fills me with dread. I'm a teacher. In fact, I'm glad the introduction said the first time I came to Baruch was 20 years ago. I think I make this a once every 10-year event. I try to avoid this part of town most of the time unless I have to go to an Indian restaurant on Lexington Avenue. But 20 years ago, the topic I did was about teaching. How do you teach? What is it that the craft of teaching? Did any of you at that session? You probably retired if you were at that session. That session was carried on, was picked up, it was recorded, it was put on YouTube. And I was just checking the YouTube views. It's got 250,000 views. Not bad for a Baruch session recorded with a bad camera 20 years ago. But I'm going to set the stage here. About 20 years ago, I had, I wouldn't say midlife crisis, but a midlife decision-making point. And I made 3 decisions, and I've kind of stuck with them. One is I said, I'm never going to dress up for anybody ever again. You call me to a meeting of CEOs, I'm going to come as I am. I'm not a trained monkey to get in a 3-piece suit and show up just because. And let's face it, they're going to be spending far more on their suits than I am. So the notion that somehow wearing a suit signals to the world that you're serious, we've got to let that go. The second thing I promised myself was that I was never going to write an academic paper for the rest of my life. Why? Because you're asking questions that nobody cares what the answer is. You spend 5 years of your life going on and on and on. You finally publish the paper. It gets published in a journal that nobody reads. And I said, life's too short. I don't want to do that. Doesn't mean I stop writing, but I write for a very different audience. And thirdly, I lost my filtering mechanism. I just say what's on my mind. What's the worst that can happen? NYU can fire me, but I live in La Jolla and 2 blocks from the beach. You fire me, I'm going to hang out at the beach all through the year. So I'm going to tell you up front that I have zero desire to tread lightly in this space. I'm going to say exactly how I feel, and I feel really strongly. And if you want to push back, I would welcome people who disagree with me. In fact, a few weeks from now, I'm supposed to be on the panel with BlackRock's head of sustainability. I can't wait. I can't wait. She's getting cold feet. Let's see if she shows up, but I can't wait. 3 months from now, I'm supposed to be on the panel with a McKinsey head of ESG. I can't wait. So I'm going to say up front what I think about this concept, so you're in no delusions that I'm going to give you on the one hand and the other hand. Here's how I describe ESG. This is a concept born in sanctimony, nurtured with hypocrisy, and sold with sophistry. And that kind of puts all the cards on the table. You know where it was born, right? It was born out of a UN document that Kofi Annan put together in 2004. I would like you to think about anything good that has come out of a UN document in the 75 years the UN has been around, and already you're on shaky ground. Nurtured with hypocrisy. I have never seen a space as filled with hypocrisy as this space. A few weeks ago, I was asked to talk at an ESG conference. I don't know why they keep inviting me, because I piss everybody off. And this was in, I think, Oslo. They said, will you fly out? And I said, are you guys out of your mind? You might get on a plane, create how much of a carbon footprint, I don't know, till I get to Oslo. I'll stand in front of, but I decided to do it on Zoom, and the first question I asked, there were 1,000 people, is where did you guys come from? And 95% of them flowed from somewhere to get to Oslo to tell us how, that they cared about global climate change. And the way they were going to show it was by creating a carbon footprint the size of a small country, and then tell the rest of the world, look, no, this is what you should be doing. And sold with sophistry. This is a gravy train. There are consultants making money. There are bankers making money. There are investment funds making money. You know who's not making money? All the companies that are advising and say, this is going to make you good. You know who's not benefiting? Supposedly the society that they're claiming to save. If a concept can be both toxic and empty at the same time, it's kind of tough to pull off, right? To be toxic, you've got to have something. ESG has managed to pull it off in 20 years. So you know where I'm coming from. So I'm not going to hold back. And as I said, I will present you with the facts. You're welcome to push back. You can hear everything that you know. If you teach a class on ESG, I feel sympathy for you. But I'd welcome your pushback on what you think I'm missing in this space. Now, I've been in this business of valuation and corporate finance for 40 years now. And I've learned to become cynical along the way. Why? Because we teach about fundamentals, we teach about cash flows, but the reality is this is a space filled with what I call weapons of mass distraction. You know what I mean by weapons of mass distraction? You do the numbers on a project or an acquisition, it doesn't fly, but you really, really want to do it. What do? You bring out a weapon of mass distraction. It's strategic. Most dangerous word ever invented in business, right? You know what it means? The numbers don't fly, but I really, really want to do this. A strategic deal is just a really stupid deal, but you want to do it. A strategic buyer is exactly the buyer you want to find if you're selling your business, because they've already made up their mind on how much to pay before they show up. Who does that? But the words keep rolling on, right? It's strategic, and China for a while. If you had, I wanted to add an extra zero to your value, you know what he said? We're in China. Oh, extra zero in your value. Now, from tech, you got this whole set of buzzwords. Web3, I have no idea what that even means. The metaverse, it's a space, but it's not a business. And ESG kind of fits in that space. It's become this weapon of mass distraction that you pull out. You say, you know what, this is a terrible product, but it's good. It'll make our ESG score go up. So I'm going to kind of compress what I'm going to say for the rest of the class and list out the 5 big questions I want to address. And on each one, as I said, I'll take what ESG says, I'll look at the evidence and say, show me. So here's the first one. The ESG promise, and this I think has been at the core of its destruction, is it's gone around promising good stuff for everybody with no downside. I mean, if you're in business, you know that everything is a trade-off, right? I've never seen something in business where it's an unalloyed good. You do something, there's always another side. You can choose not to look at it. So what drew my attention to ESG in 2019 was I was curious. I said, how can something create all this good stuff with it's cake without calories? Let me explain. You had ESG consultants going to companies and saying, if you're good, you'll be more valuable. Larry Fink was saying this, right? Yeah. Goodness is automatic. They were going to investors and saying, you want to make more money? You can be good. Just buy ESG funds. And of course, to society, the sales pitch is, if companies all follow the ESG rule book, we will all be better off as a society. Now, suspend the questions about ESG for a moment. Think about human history. Through the history of humanity, is it been easier to be good or to be bad? I mean, it's a generic question. It was easy to be good. You would never need the 10 Commandments, right? You wouldn't need religion because we would all take the good path. It's always been more difficult to follow the good path. And of course, they hold the price. You know, you do this, you're going to go to heaven. You do this, you're not going to go to hell. You can either do the carrot or the stick, but you hope the combination will keep you on the path. Goodness has always meant giving up something. And ESG kind of cut against the core of that very human phenomenon. It said, look, you can be good, but there's no consequence for you. And that, to me, is at the heart of why ESG is where it is now, because it's been sold as all good, no bad, all upside, no downside. You can be charitable and there's no consequence, and we're reaping what we sow. So let's get the show on the road. There are 5 questions I'm going to ask. First, I'm going to go to the core. What the heck are you measuring with ESG? There are 5 services now, at the minimum, that measure ESG, an ESG score. Sustainalytics does it, S&P does it. They come up with a number. What are you measuring? I happen to be on the panel with the head of Morningstar's sustainability group. I don't think he's going to show up on a panel again. And I said, I'm just curious, what exactly are you measuring? If you're an outsider looking, they must be measuring goodness, right? I'm going to start with the premise that ESG is trying to measure something that is not measurable on a global scale. And there's a simple reason. If I went around this room and asked you to describe what a good person is to you, I'll wager I'll have 50 different descriptions, right? Why? Because it'll reflect where you were born, what your culture is, what your religion is, what your background is. We each have our own measure of what goes into goodness. For some people, it might be as simple as, if a person goes to church every Sunday or to temple every Friday, that's my definition of goodness. For other people, it might be how good they're to the... So each of us has our own measure of goodness. How the heck did Sustainalytics develop this Dalai Lama-like capacity to measure goodness for all of us? Already, I'm a little suspicious that any entity, I don't care how smart people are, is able to take something that is a personal measure and come up with a global measure. You're going to see how this plays out in the actual ESG scores for companies, because you're measuring something that it's not that it's subjective or it's personal. So guess what you're going to see? If you have 5 services measuring the goodness of a company, you're going to get 5 different measures depending on what they put front. So we're going to start with that, and it's a feature, not a bug. Because people talk about convergence. You're not going to get convergence on this. This is not like measuring default risk, right? Because we know what it is, and we can get convergence on it. This is a measure that is basically going to be different things to different people. I'm going to start with that question. Second question, I want to take on Larry Fink. He stopped talking now, good for him. He should have stopped talking about 3 years ago on this topic, if you ask me. But for a while, he got away with saying, hey, being good is good for companies. That's why ESG is a factor in BlackRock. You're now in my territory. I live in valuation. I talk about value. So my reaction when I heard that was, show me. Where? Is it higher growth? Is it higher margins? Is it lower risk? And I looked at the collection of what passes for ESG research. I'm going to say something incredibly mean about this space, but I mean every word of it. It's horrendously bad in terms of its collective impact. In fact, this is the only area of research in finance where people use meta-studies. You know what meta-studies are? rather than quote one study, they'll take an average of 500 studies. You know why you do that? Because it's like the law of large numbers. They're all crappy. If I take the average, somehow the average is going to tell me something about what happens. I'm going to take the evidence and I'm going to argue that much as ESG research claims that being good is going to make you more profitable, that nothing in the evidence backs up a proposition. I'll give you one little glimmer of hope on risk and a certain kind of dip, catastrophic risk. But that's really advice on don't be bad, not don't be, try to be good. So we'll talk about that area of research and why you don't need ESG to get there. So I'm going to talk about the connection of ESG to value. And the basic bottom line is some companies may benefit from a good image because their customer base likes goodness and they buy, so they actually can. I'll let you throw out examples of companies that are benefiting from good. I'll give you, for every example of a company, you can show me that is benefit from doing good. I'll give you a counterexample of a company that's benefit from being bad. Let's have a contest. Let's see who created more value along the way. I'm not saying this is, as something that I approve or don't approve, but I'm saying the notion that goodness is always improves value is just completely based on made-up stuff. Let's take the third question. Investment funds have been going around selling people on the notion that if you buy an ESG fund, that investing in good companies will deliver higher returns. I mean, I know the Baruch has an endowment fund. It's probably smaller than the NYU endowment fund, which is smaller than the Harvard endowment fund. We can all look somewhere else and say, I wish I were them. But this is something that's come in front of the NYU endowment fund. I got a call about 3 years ago saying, we want to be good, but we also want to make higher returns. And I said, I want to eat everything I can and keep my weight at what it is today. It doesn't work that way, right? But that's what they've been sold. You can do what makes you happy. Invest in good companies. Avoid fossil fuel. I mean, there are all these evil companies that put no tobacco, no fossil fuel. And you can still earn higher returns. I'm okay with the no fossil fuel and the no tobacco, but you're violating one of the first things you're taught in operations research, right? An unconstrained optimal will always beat a constrained optimal. This is not something I make up. It's just pure math. And when you do ESG, what are you doing? When you do ESG investing, you're creating a constraint. By all means, do so. But don't tell me that creating a constraint will deliver a higher value than not putting that constraint in. It goes against everything I know, not about finance, but about pure math. I'm going to look at the evidence on ESG and returns, and for a while it looked really good. You all saw all these charts that people used to show high ESG, look at the returns you made. And I'm going to go under the surface, and you're very quickly going to see where those returns came from. And then I'm going to ask you, did you really invest in goodness, or did you buy some tech companies along the way? If you believe Facebook is a really good company, and ExxonMobil is a really bad company, I've already lost you, right? Because you have a definition of goodness that's based on climate change. But what if my definition of goodness is privacy? To me, Facebook is the most evil company on the face of the earth. But I'm going to look at the returns from especially the last decade, where people could go around and say, look, you can invest in ESG, and look, you can make higher returns. And what has happened in the last 3 years to kind of destroy the BlackRock argument of you can have your cake and eat it too? Reality has this odd way of intruding on these made-up narratives. And reality in this case took the form of Russia invading Ukraine, and all of a sudden the ESG story kind of blew up in your faces. I didn't have the least bit of sympathy when it happened. I love to see the contortions that ESG people had to go through to now get back on the side of goodness. I'll give you an example of a news story. And I want you to play the role of ESG people. So you're in the business of measuring goodness. So here's how the news story starts. Philip Morris, if I stop right there, you're going to be on the good side or the bad side? That terrible company, cigarettes, right? It's going to give away 500,000 cigarettes for free. You're saying, this is awful. They're taking an addictive substance that causes cancer. They're giving it away for free. You're ready to put in the bad story, right? To Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines. All of a sudden, it's getting a little shaky, right? Because in the world we're in, Ukraine is good, Russia is bad. I'm not talking about the politics of it. And now you're saying, is that good or is that bad? You know, weapons manufacturers used to be bad until about 2 years ago, and now all of a sudden they're starting to look good again, depending on who they sell the weapons to. Do you really want this to be the basis for judging companies? Because it's not even that the basis is subjective, it's going to keep shifting on you. So this notion that you can make higher returns based on ESG just doesn't stand up on common sense, and the data doesn't back it up. The reason BlackRock, head of sustainability, cannot get on a public panel now is they have a problem. Because if being good costs you returns, right? If you've got to give up returns, and remember, BlackRock doesn't invest its own money. It's investing your money, my money, other people's pension money. And by superimposing not those people's definition of good, but Larry Fink's definition of good, they deliver 30 basis points less than they should be. You got a fiduciary problem the size of several elephants. And it's only a matter of time before that stuff hits the fan. So this notion that investing in good companies is going to deliver higher returns, come on. When something sounds too good to be true, it's not true. Right? Now, sometimes when I do these ESG sessions, I show it's not good for value, it's not good for returns. The final fallback is, but it's good for society. Really? Yes, he's done such an amazing job on energy, right? You know what percentage of our energy came from fossil fuels 10 years ago before ESG took off? About 82%. You know what percentage of our energy comes from fossil fuels today? About 82%, maybe 83%. So where's all the good stuff happening? Remember when Engine 1 celebrated that famous victory? Engine 1 is a little activist fund. Takes a position in ExxonMobil. And it wins this amazing fight where it gets ExxonMobil to sell some of its fossil fuel reserves. Amazing, you've done a great job. The key word is sell. If you sell your reserves, what's happening? Somebody is buying those reserves, right? I'm going to show you a graph. Do you know how much money private equity has invested in fossil fuels in the last 15 years? About $1.5 trillion. So what have you accomplished with ESG? You've taken it out of the hands of companies like Royal Dutch and ExxonMobil, where you had a semblance of a hope of perhaps developing it in a more sensible way. You put it in the hands of some of the least scrupulous people on the face of the earth. And then you step back and say, why aren't good things happening? And then you get the final fallback, which is, but I want to make the world a better place. We all do. This is not about, do you want to make the, of course we do. The question is, how do I do it without having ESG? How did we live before 2008? We must have been, barbarians going around chopping each other's heads off. This notion that until ESG came along, virtue hadn't been invented is the implicit message, right? You're in a building named after Bernard Baruch. The man made his money in investing in business, but he gave a big chunk of it back to society, right? Warren Buffett and Peter Lynch have giving pledges, and I know you might have issues with it, and I'm sorry, Warren Buffett and Bill Gates. And you might have issues with Bill Gates on vaccinations. I won't fight that fight with you. But they're giving pledges during their lifetime. This notion that until ESG came along, nobody thought about virtue is absurd. You know what ESG is trying to do? It's taking decisions that used to be made at the individual level, and it's trying to make it collectivist. If you think that this process is not going to create a backlash, you've been living in a cave. And as you know, in the last 2 years, it's in the middle of a political maelstrom, right? The red states say, if you have ESG, we're not going to use you. The blue states say, if you have ESG. Is this where you want business to be? But when ESG people complain about the political backlash on ESG, I'm reminded of pyromaniacs complaining about the fires all over the place. You brought politics into this process with that S in ESG. Name me one social issue where there's consensus. I can't think of a single one. You can try to dress it up and make it as non-provocative as possible, but once you start digging, there's going to be disagreement. So how the heck does Sustainalytics decide which side of the social divide makes you a good company and which one makes it a bad company? So we've got a lot to talk about. So let's start with the first question. Let me pause. If you have are there any issues? So clearly I've laid out a very balanced view of ESG. Yeah, go ahead.
So there's a lot of confusion about ESG and what it really means. You seem to have taken the approach of equating ESG with goodness. What's the basis for that? Because if you look back at you mentioned Kofi Annan and the intention of the Principles for Responsible Investment, the 6 principles only refer to the fact that ESG would be taken into account in investment decision making.
And what was the end game? What did Kofi Annan hope to get from ESG being taken in?
I'm just saying that I don't see that being equated with goodness in any way.
So what do you think ESG measures? What do you think Kofi?
ESG means
whatever
many
people.
different things to many people.
And that's exactly my point. So how the heck can Sustainalytics put a score on that?
But that's because of the core of the confusion that now exists about ESG.
But is that confusion ever going to go away? This is as long as people have been on the face of the earth. We have different religions. Because you've heard of Islamic finance, right? And you've also heard of the Anno Domini fund. Have you heard of it? This is, people old enough probably. The Anno Domini fund was actually a fund created around Catholic principles. It said, we're going to invest in companies that follow essentially what we think of as goodness. And you're saying, how's that different from ESG? Well, if you go back and look, I looked at the prospectus for the Anno Domini fund. They said, if you invest with us, you will make 50 basis points less than on the market, but you go to heaven. That's a bit trade-off, right? So basically, that I understand. So if you want to give up something for a bigger benefit, you want climate change. And that's why I said this problem started when they decided not to sugarcoat the cost and sell you on the plus. I agree with you. I don't know whether ESG measures goodness. In fact, when I contested Sustainalytics, they said it measures risk now. I said, really? Welcome to this arena, because I live with risk every day. I said, what kind of risk? Equity risk or default risk? It's clear the Morningstar person hadn't thought about this yet. He said, no, it could be any kind of risk. I said, is it risk that is captured in the financials or risk that will not be? He hadn't thought about it. If you're going to use risk as if that's what's measuring, at least let's start to get explicit, because if you get explicit, then I can measure whether you're actually delivering on that risk, right? How do we know ratings measure default risk? What does Moody's and S&P do every year that lets you, at least on average, believe that ratings measure default risk? Every year they update this. They have a table where they take the ratings from 10, 20, 30 years ago, and they track what percentage of companies within each ratings class actually default. Here's the good news. AAA rated bonds, 0.03%. CCC rated bonds, about 23.33%. At least we can hold them accountable. We can disagree with ratings agencies, but the reason we use ratings is at least if you don't tell me what risk you're measuring, how do I hold you accountable? You can't tell me after the fact, you know what, if you'd used ESG, you would never invested in Valiant. How do I know that? In fact, do you know that companies operating in Russia before the Russian invasion had higher ESG scores than companies not operating in Russia? There's nothing that I've got from ESG scores that have warned me. After the fact, they said, we're now going to bring in country risk into ESG. Okay, every time something happens, you're going to bring it in. Because let's play along. Let's say you bring China risk into ESG. They're a company with exposure to China. Now we're going to test how much companies are willing to pay for a higher ESG score. Remember how quickly companies left Russia right after it invaded Ukraine? Why? Because most companies had minuscule percentages of revenues. McDonald's might have been one of the bigger exposures, minuscule. Outside of oil companies and a very few, maybe service companies. So leaving Russia was giving up 1.5%. So when I wrote about the Russia-Ukraine invasion, I said, I'd be interested to know if China invades Taiwan, how many companies are going to say, I'm going to do the right thing and get out of China. I'd hope we don't have to run that experiment in real time. But when 30% of your revenues come from China and half your manufacturing is in China, how the heck do you walk away as easily? It's easy to make these small sacrifices. Say, look how good I am. And that's what we're encouraging companies to do. We're putting gestures of goodness over actual goodness. So let's start with, yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, but to me it seems like you're deliberately trying to not understand.
Maybe help me out. So tell me, what am I not understanding about ESG?
I mean, I agree with the gentleman here that no one ever said it was about goodness. I think the most ESG investors are they're examining material ESG issues, which are defined by standards out there, such as SASB. So while it's true that sustainability...
This is the E part of ESG.
No, all of them.
What about the S part? Show me one measure of S that is stuck. E, I agree with you, right? We can talk about climate change. We can talk. Name me one S issue.
How about at ExxonMobil,
Right.
whether there were deaths in the field, just health and safety?
That's still in the E. That's
S.
still in the E part of the
No,
ESG, right?
that's definitely an S.
Okay. So what
How
about
many
so?
deaths happened on oil rigs?
Okay.
That is an S issue.
Okay. So
Right? And I don't think anyone
as an
would
investor, then
agree about
tell
that.
me the consequences. Does it mean you get higher returns by avoiding companies like that?
So as I was saying,
Yeah.
what ESG investing is all about is looking at the material E, S, and G issues for companies across different sectors that have been defined by standards. And yes, while there is some disagreement between the different rating agencies, Moody's and Sustainalytics and MSCI do have some differences across them.
Right.
What they're mainly looking for is how well is a company handling the risk across these different issues. Are they doing a good job
Right.
of handling the risk, or are they doing a bad job? So if it's Facebook, the ESG issue is data privacy. If it's ExxonMobil, it might be health and safety in the field, or it might be emissions.
Right.
If it's some other technology company, it might be cybersecurity risk. And tell me, what investor doesn't want someone that is facing cybersecurity risk to not invest in cyber insurance and data privacy measures?
But
Who would want
I don't disagree with you.
to spend that? So when you say
The question is that measure helping actually catch that risk? I'm going to argue that nothing in the Sustainalytics ESG score helps me on that dimension. That it's become a checkbox.
you read them?
Absolutely.
It doesn't sound like you have.
I have, because I've seen the scores, right? It doesn't matter what they say, look at what they do. All I have to do is look at their scores and look at the companies. You know that, I was going to show this graph. Do you know that larger companies have higher ESG scores than smaller companies? It's well established. Are you telling me the larger companies are more noble than smaller companies, better run, less risky? I don't think so. ESG has become, we teach in business schools. Remember in 1981, business schools Business Week started ranking business schools? And then once they started ranking, they created a gaming model that business schools learn to play. The minute you start attaching a score to something, it is going to get gamed. You might call it greenwashing, but greenwashing is not a bug, it's a feature. You create a game, people are going to game it. And ESG is being gamed like no other measure that I've ever seen. So when I see they've given me, I read the whole document of what they claim to do, but ultimately you're delivering a score. The test is, what do your scores tell me about companies? You heard about the Adani Group? I wrote about it on Saturday. I posted it on Saturday night at 11 p.m. I woke up the next morning and there were 50,000 people had watched that YouTube video. The Adani Group is an infrastructure company in India, politically connected. And you know what its ESG score is? Really high. It's played the checkbox really well. Much as the services like to talk about what they'd like to measure, this is what you actually put out as a score is the most revealing part of what you do. I don't care how noble you make the process look, the scores don't lie, and they don't measure either risk or goodness on any dimension. Now we can say if we can fix the scores, make them less. You can't fix scores. Once you have a scoring system, people will game it. It's human nature. And guess who has the most resources to game? Big companies, profitable companies. I'm laying the foundations for why some companies often have higher scores. This is very, the direction of the causation can be both ways, right? Are ESG companies profitable, or are profitable companies able to play the ESG game better? So you can believe the hype that comes out of the service about what they claim to measure. But you look at the actual number, and you say, does that measure my exposure to all these material risks? And now, from a valuation perspective, I look at that score and I say, this tells me absolutely nothing about exposure. I have to do my own digging to do the exposure because it's not being captured in the score. So I think services are painting a picture of what they're measuring that is so fuzzy you can't even critique it because that's not. It's the old arguments against socialism. You'd say socialism hasn't worked, and you say, but it's not being done the right way, right? If they just did it the way it should be done, it would have worked. And you get this with ESG as well, which is you point out that it's not working, it hasn't worked, and they say, if only we did it the right way. Okay. So I'll show you the scores. You can make your judgments for yourselves. But essentially, the notion that you can measure ESG, whether it's goodness or risk at a collective level, when in fact you're trying to bring in factors that are, let's face it, if ESG is actually material in the immediate numbers, you wouldn't need ESG, right? Because what does material mean? It's already showing up in the earnings. It's already showing up in the cash flows. I don't need, the very notion of ESG means it's not quite material now, but it could be material in the future, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't need this as an extra add-on. Yep.
You think that the intent of having ESG would be to maybe foster technological innovation? So that
The intent of having ESG is to make money. The question was about the intent of having ESG, whether it's to foster disclosure more than technological innovation, right? Let's face it. That's where the ESG train is going, is they want companies to disclose. The disclosure leads to change afterwards, we can argue. But the immediate aim is we'd like companies to disclose. By itself, you're saying, what's wrong with that? And I don't have a problem with it. I think disclosure is good. But I do have a problem with the notion that more information is better than less information. That disclosing more makes us more informed. Last year, I actually wrote a piece called Disclosure Diarrhea. Because I live with 10Ks. I've seen prospectuses. I'll give you an example. You know what? Microsoft went public in 1986. It filed a prospectus like all companies had to do. You know how long the Microsoft prospectus was? 66 pages. Yeah. Airbnb, Uber, they all went public, 2019, 20. You know how long the Airbnb prospectus was? 450 pages. 50 pages of that was one of the most useless disclosures of all time. It's called the risk section. Have you ever, it's clearly written by lawyers for lawyers. It'll say things like, competition might be stronger than expected, our earnings will drop. Thank you for letting me know. I never thought about that until you mentioned it. The problem with disclosure diarrhea is you reach a tipping point, and we know this from psychology, where you stop reading completely. In a strange way, companies disclose more, but investors seem to know less. It's almost like this process, and it's intentional. They're drowning you with data, hoping you don't catch the information. We're mistaking data for information. I'll predict, and I hope I'm wrong in this, that 5 years from now, every company is going to have a 200-page ESG disclosure. It's already happening in Europe. I'll also predict that two things will happen. Nobody will read those disclosures, much as we like to talk about how much we care about them. And second, We're going to miss the big stuff from the small stuff. And I'll give you one example of this. In California, we have this very strange system of direct democracy where people can actually change laws through propositions. So you can put a proposition on and say, everybody's last name should start with N. I'm just picking an absurd example. And if 51% of Californians vote yes, the proposition passes, you can go and contest in the court saying this is constitutionally. But they pass, and people get propositions on it. So about 1986, there's a proposition called Prop 65. It's a proposition written with the best of intentions. You know what it requires companies to do? If any of the products, any of the inputs to their products can create cancer, you have to disclose it. And we all agree that that's a good thing, right? The only problem is you pass the proposition, it becomes law. Everybody worries about, remember, some of your inputs, you have no idea whether it causes cancer or not. And of course, a whole horde of lawyers, let's remember, disclosure also creates, there's money being made. There's entire legal teams being created. So a legal team comes out and they basically start suing companies. Your product could. So you know what companies started doing? Disclosing that their product, I'm not kidding. I walk into my taco stand in La Jolla. And there's a notice up there. Prop 65 requires us to tell you that tacos could cause cancer. I'm not kidding. And I asked the guy, what in the taco causes? Is it the cilantro? He said, I don't know, but I just put it up there. This way I'm protected. But here are the consequences. About 4 weeks after that, I come out of my house. My neighbor's son is outside smoking a cigarette, not weed, because San Diego, you take your dog for a walk, you come back high. There's so much weed and smoke in the air. He's smoking a cigarette, and I said, what are you doing? Cigarettes cause cancer. You know what his answer was? Everything causes cancer. Tacos cause cancer. This is what happens when you mix the big stuff with the small stuff. I'll tell you what's going to happen to climate disclosure. You're going to get 500 items disclosed, and some will matter and some will not. So if I have advice on the disclosure front, less is more. Decide on the 3 climate disclosures that you like companies to make and stick with those 3. And I like what you said about what companies should. I don't want Facebook disclosing their carbon footprint. I want them to focus on disclosing their privacy issues. The problem is the way disclosure laws are written, it's one size fits all, right? So you'll have 50 pages from Facebook on how little carbon footprint they have. This is like when you buy meat and it says gluten-free. You notice this? You say gluten-free. What the heck is gluten? I know it's gluten. It's meat. I know you're not adding wheat to the damn thing. But it's gluten-free. Same thing starts to happen when you make companies disclose things on things they really don't have much of an impact on. So I'll present my measurement part, and I want you to go back and look at not what Sustainalytics says they measure, but the scores. Take any sector where you're familiar with the companies, look at the scores, and ask yourself a question, is this score giving me a rough sense of which oil company is most exposed to these risks and which company is least exposed? I'll let you be the judge. Pick whatever sector you feel comfortable, pick the ESG scores. So when you look at ESG survey, they keep shifting the target on me. When I said goodness, the original idea was basically going around telling people, you feel a little guilty about making a lot of money in this market, buy an ESG fund. And that might not have been the actual full text, but that was a subtext. So if you think goodness has not been part of the conversation, that's a recent phenomenon. The original push for ESG was not based on risk. It was based on goodness. They've changed their. I can go back and find you actual ESG pushes, advocates in the middle of the last decade. And somewhere in the last 4 years, they've discovered that this is not defensible anymore, that risk is a more defensible part. We'll come back. That's actually a debatable question. Are high ESG companies less risky?
I have a question.
Yep.
So I fully agree on the whole ESG perspective that you're saying. But when it comes to G, the governance part, every time we are valuing a company, when we take up a growth number in our mind, it is actually backed up by the governance, right?
Okay, that's
like for example, with Adani or with startup ecosystem, WeWork, Uber. So and then
I absolutely agree. And I've always wondered why the G is in ESG. And I'll tell you why. It's an issue. The traditional history of corporate governance is about managers being accountable to shareholders, right? You go back 50 years, you look at the... you know what the G in ESG is for? That managers are accountable to stakeholders. You know, when people are accountable to everyone, they're accountable to no one. It's one of the facts of life. Because it allows you to blame somebody else, right? Why was my stock down? Because I had to take care of the bondholders. You go to the bondholders, why is my price? Oh, because I had to care of... It's amazing how... And CEOs love this. Stakeholder wealth maximization is a mirage, right? I call it the kumbaya view of the world. We're going to have all the stake. It's absurd that 2019 roundtable, the business roundtable thing, one of the worst written documents of all time. As I read it, I said, I hope you guys never have to actually sit in your own companies and make project decisions and financing decisions, because you give me a template that basically leads me to decision paralysis. So when I see the G in ESG, I'm reminded, you guys are too young to remember, there was an East Germany and a West Germany. You know what East Germany was called? Anybody remember? The German Democratic Republic. There was nothing democratic about East Germany. There was nothing republic about the East Germany. But why did they use it? It's Orwellian, right? We call ourselves the German, it's a People's Republic of China. Come on, guys. Do you really think somebody basically, what will the people want? Do you think that's the driving force? The G in ESG needs to be removed. And the strongest evidence for ESG actually comes from the G part, but the corporate governance part. So they've actually extracted the good stuff from the governance research, claimed that it's in support of ESG. And I say, no, that's a different G. This is not the G that... So I agree with you that governance matters, but not the G.
So we want
in ESG.
we should have a different structure to...
You know what? You're already saying, why the heck did you bundle these three together, right? I mean, if I had my druthers, I'd take the E and keep it separate because I think there's more consensus, more measurable, more disclosure. You can make arguments about risks that are cleaner. The S part, just get rid of it. Yeah, the S part, I think you're asking for trouble. You're putting yourself in the heart of politics, right? For some companies, you might have no choice because your employees have something, you might have to do it. But you don't want to be drawn into political conversations when... Do you really want the world to look like politics has looked here for the last decade? Everything is toxic. Every company will look like a Twitter board after this, right? I mean, it's, people insult, and that's the S part. So I think you're raising a good question. Why the hell did they bundle E and the S and the G in one? I don't know. But maybe to create something that's so fuzzy that you can't even attack it, right? Because they attack it, say, that's not what I meant. This is the different definition I have. So the measurement part of ESG, first, it's fuzzy. I mean, if it's material, you don't need it, right? If it's material, I see it in the earnings already. I don't need ESG to convince me otherwise. So it has to be future materiality based on what you think will matter in the long term. Okay. You're forward-looking. I actually had the singular misfortune of talking to 50 CSOs. You've never heard of a CSO, right? You know what CSO is? A Chief Sustainability Officer. These are very large companies. So I was just curious. I said, what do you guys do? What is a Chief Sustainability Officer? I can understand making the earth more sustainable, right? But what does it mean when you say you make a company more sustainable? Is it like the Egyptian pharaohs who wanted to live forever? You know what their plan was, right? After they died, they wrapped themselves in bandages, put themselves in a crypt and say, surround me with my favorite stuff. And you know what happened? 2,000 years later, some British explorer came and stole all their stuff. The notion of corporate sustainability strikes me as absurd. Companies grow, they mature, they decline, and they die. Let them go. So I said, what exactly is your job? And it's amazing how much confusion there was in the room about what exactly they did. So I'll give you from the most benign to the most malignant version. The most benign version was, we're forward thinking. We tell the company about things that could happen 10 years from now. I said, did you go to the Dalai Lama school of, I mean, you must be some kind of a deep thinker long term to make yourself special. The second, and these were the more honest people, said, we're like Jiminy Cricket. They didn't use that word, but that's what I read. Remember the Pinocchio movies? What does Jiminy Cricket do? He stands on Pinocchio's shoulder and he reminds them, right? He's a conscience. He's like with a corporate conscience. Okay, that I can get. So you're basically in that room, and as companies make big decisions here, but you need to think about it. You know what Pinocchio did with Jiminy Cricket, though, right? He completely ignored him, and it's only when he got into trouble, on whatever that island was that he went to, that's when he said, what, I should have listened. And the third is this version of, we're going to create companies that last forever. That's terrifying. That's terrifying because this morning I was talking to, I don't do consulting, but I talk to people in different companies because they're just interested in getting abused, I guess. So this is Weight Watchers, right? Weight Watchers company's been around 60 years. Company that's aging. And I started the session by asking, did you see Lizzo on the stage yesterday? And in a sense, the reason I was bringing that up was, here you have the core of the problem, right? Which is 50 years ago when Weight Watchers started, what was the end game? We'll help you lose 15 pounds and we'll give you support in losing that. We're in a world where that might itself be off the table, right? So I think there's a point at which companies have to wake up and say, you know what, our best days are behind us and it's time to coast to the end. CEOs fight it till the bitter end. They want to preserve, they want to grow. Why? Because when was the last time you saw a movie about a CEO who made his company smaller? I haven't. But I've seen lots of movies about empire builders, right? We celebrate people who make their companies bigger. We denigrate people who even if it's the right thing to do. So ESG, at least in its broadest form, is fuzzy. It is person-specific. That's why I said if we go around, each of us came up with a measure of ESG, I'll wager it'll be different. In fact, one of the tests I run is I give students in my class, before I give them the ESG measurement, I give them 10 companies and ask them to rank it on an ESG basis from best to worst. Guess what? There's almost no correlation. Depending on what you value most, you're going to but it's still being measured. That monster is out of the gate. It's not going back. Companies are making decisions based on that score. That's the terrifying part. And I talked to a student of mine who's high up in BHP. BHP, as you know, is an Australian mining company. And he said, we're planning to sell off our oil business. They have an oil business on the side. I said, why? He said, because we sell it off, our ESG score will jump 5 points. I said, okay, that's amazing. Congratulations for saving the world. Your ESG score goes up 5 points. Your oil business ends up in somebody else's hands. At least be honest about what you've accomplished. You've improved your ESG score, but you did it because you think somehow that ESG score is going to deliver more returns or a higher price for you. Now you don't even need this graph. But what we value varies across people, it varies across age. So this actually came from a panel where they asked people, what do you care about? And what older people went into what they valued is very different from what younger people do. I'd love to know what the ages of the people are at Morningstar Sustainalytics. Wouldn't you? Do you think that matters? Of course it does. And that shouldn't, right? If this is truly something objective, you're measuring risk, why should it matter whether a bunch of 25-year-olds measure it or a bunch of 50-year-olds measure it? But it does seem to change. So here's the bottom line. Because you're measuring something that it's not that it's unmeasurable, but measurable differently by different people, there is no consensus. The rankings are all over the place. And the definitions keep shifting. So today it's risk. I'll wager if risk stops working, they will find something else that they claim ESG measures. I'm waiting for it. But when they come up with it, I'm going to hit them with the data. Say, okay, let's see if in fact that's what you're measuring. So there are lots of research on this front, where if you look at the correlation in ESG scores across services, you discover very quickly. You know, the correlation across bond ratings across companies is like 0.97. Moody's and S&P disagree, but the disagreements are rare. The agreements are. With ESG, you're all over the place. Does that surprise me? Not in the least. As I said, I'd love to get all of the ESG service in one room. First, look at the ages and the backgrounds of each table, and I can probably predict what they're weighting in more. And you're going to get very different scores. And even on big companies, this is not just low-profile companies. On high-profile companies, there's disagreement about whether these companies score high or low. But here comes the most troublesome part. I talked about this. As companies get bigger, their ESG scores go up. That makes no sense to me. Makes no sense to me. Unless in your world somehow bigger companies are creating less social costs and less exposure there is, I think they actually create more, but they know how to play the game better. And as disclosures go up, the collective ESG scores for all companies are going up. This is amazing. We're making companies so... We must live in a world surrounded by much better behaved companies than 10 years ago, right? At least that's what the ESG services seem to suggest. Yes?
So, Amit, our company is involved with not doing the scores, but with basically creating business models to benefit from the sustainability portion of it. And I can share with confidence with a lot of you, with all of these larger companies, no one cares. The brutally honest truth is, this is all lipstick for the branding. They don't want it to have any impact on this investment decision making, on profit and losses, but it's important for both for social responsibility and for the branding of the company that they're doing something that's forward thinking. But what while I hear everything that you're sharing, there's a number of benefits that have come from this, and I think one of the things that I'd like you to share is where do you this is the infancy of a new industry, and where do you see it evolving, both 5, 10, and 15?
The acronym I'd most like to see attached to it is RIP. Rest in peace, right? Rest in peace. I mean, this is, I think, an acronym that needs to be throttled in the cradle. I know it's a terrible, vision to have, but nothing good is going to come out of this. Nothing good. You're going to get 200 pages of disclosure. You're going to get an ecosystem of people who will be effectively feeding into the system. But I think we risk doing more damage to the society we claim to help than good. Because we're allowing companies, the original paper I wrote in 2019 on ESG is, do you want to do good or do you want to sound good? And unfortunately, sounding good has become much more critical than doing good. And I don't see anything good coming out of this space. I used to, in 2019, think it could be saved. I no longer do. I think it's got to be split up into the E, the S, and the G parts. I think we need to be open and clear about what exactly the risks we're talking about. If that is going to be the selling point, is it risk in cash flows, risk in earnings, risk in the company might go under, is it reputational risk and how it plays out? And then we need to hold these services accountable because they claim that it measures that kind of risk. I'm going to come back and say 5 years later, it doesn't look like you caught any of the companies that had reputational collapses. We need to hold services accountable. And for that to happen, we need them to start to get specific. So that's going to be my job, is to nail them down. So I hope that I get another chance with Morningstar, and I hope I can nail them down on exactly what risk they're supposedly measuring. Because then I can track it and maybe they're right. Yeah.
The difference between large cap and small cap, couldn't that just be data asymmetry where small cap companies, have less time to
That's exactly the point. And do you want a score where companies which have more time to fill out boxes get higher scores than companies with less time?
But won't that disperse as time goes on and it becomes a larger trend?
There'll always be small, those small companies get larger. Maybe their problems will be fixed. But guess what? New small companies are going to come in. If you've ever worked at a small business, you have so many operating things to do, right? You've got to survive. The last thing you have time to do is sit with the sustain analytics, the 15-page questionnaire sent you and fill out all the boxes. So I don't disagree with you. Companies with more resources will be able to check those boxes. It's not like they're becoming better companies, but I'll give you the analogy with corporate governance. About 25 years ago, we had a corporate governance crisis in the US. Remember that? Enron, Tyco. And we said, we're going to solve that problem. Law schools were very excited about this. And how do we solve the problem? Sarbanes-Oxley was passed as a law, and then we had these corporate governance services measuring corporate governance scores. Amazing. We're in a new trajectory. 20 years later, I have a question for you. Do you have if corporate governance, historic measure is shareholders have power over managers, do you feel you have more power over managers today than you did 20 years ago? And I'll use Facebook as my example. I wrote about this 4 months ago. What have we allowed companies to do in the last 20 years that's kind of devastated corporate governance at its core?
Actually, it's worse than that.
I didn't even tell you how bad it was. If it's worse than that, I'd love to.
Absolutely worse,
Yeah.
because it discourages the creation of small companies. It's putting up another barrier that a small company has.
It's not so much small companies, public companies. I'll make a prediction. If we keep pushing ESG into the public company space, we're going to push companies behind the curtain,
How many
right?
public companies were there in 2000 as compared to today?
About 8,000. Now, the number of companies, so now we're at 73, because I track it at the start of every year. It's 7,300 now. It used to be 8,100 20 years ago.
Right.
Now, by itself, it's not a large enough decline that you can say the world has shifted, but I think that if we keep pushing this publicly traded. No, there are about 7,300 going to capital IQ. Some are really tiny. They're not listed on the exchanges, but you can trade them, right? They're all over the counter.
And that destroys creativity.
Yeah, but that's, I think, an argument to be had about disclosure.
If you don't have access to capital, you can't be.
But that's a disclosure argument, right? It's all about not just ESG, but about corporate disclosures, the burden it might put on companies. But that's, I think, and that's what my disclosure diarrhea paper was about, is we're creating a system where people with resources, companies with resources, get an advantage over companies without resources because they can game the system better. Right? And that's not what we want to do. So I think you're onto something. The reason small companies might have lower scores is because they can't put the resources needed. I'll tell you, smaller business schools have always struggled against bigger business schools on the Business Week rankings. I've never been a dean. I have no desire to be a dean. I don't even think about it. I have nightmares about being a dean. But actually, my good friend was a dean at Stern, and he was given the responsibility. I think he must have done something bad in a previous life, of filling out those Business Week forms for the rankings. You know how many items there are? It's just, how much data has to be collected, he had a team of 5 working for him, collecting data to fill out that. And at Stern, we're big enough, we can have 5 people who have nothing to do, maybe 50 people with nothing to do, filling out the form. But if you're a smaller business school, you're going to have a much more difficult time going through that process. So I'm not disagreeing with it, but I'm saying, should you get rankings based on who has the most resources to fill out these forms? Or are you really measuring how good a business school is? Right? So I think that's really what troubles me, is you shouldn't be giving people or companies higher scores because they have the resources to do it. Yes, go ahead.
Please repeat the question.
Yeah, I will.
Thank you.
So if you're saying like the ESG scale and so forth is so flawed, why are these big companies like in the first place dedicating so many people and resources to fill out those forms?
The question is, if ESG is so flawed, how come so many people are jumping on the ESG bandwagon, right? There are not as many people jumping on now as 3 years ago, but there were at its peak. This was the place to be. Do you want to be the person? When I wrote my first post on ESG, I said, look, you're going to label me as a moral troglodyte for what I'm going to say. Because it'll look like I'm arguing against this notion of making the world a better place. Do you want to be at a meeting where you say, you know what, guys, this is really not doing much for the world? It's tough to be against ESG. This is not like a financial argument. It's an argument about virtue at its core. That's why I don't think this risk argument holds up. If this was just about risk, it would be a much cleaner argument. But whether you like it or not, goodness is in the room with you and arguing. And I think that was what made the discussion so unhealthy for the first decade, is people felt intimidated about pushing back. I don't care. Now, as I said, I don't care if NYU fires me, and if I don't care if people don't like me, I don't care if something. But I'm lucky enough not to care. If you're 35 years old and you're a faculty mentor at a business school, it is not a good idea to make the center of your research, I'm going to show that ESG doesn't work. Maybe easier now than 4 years ago. 4 years ago, nobody wanted to be on the other side of this argument. It's like, when did you stop beating your wife kind of question, right? I mean, what kind of answer can you give to that? It's a kind of question to which there's no good defensible answer, so people stop speaking up. Yes?
Isn't the fundamental issue that now, with the internet and Twitter and all the postings, all this information now becomes available to everyone?
So
the
when you
jump
say
on ESG
this information, what are we talking about? We're talking about
the goodness, you
Yeah.
know, if you
or badness, right?
or badness,
Right.
right? I mean, what's happened is that social media, Facebook, all these other, this would never ever come up 20 years ago because there wasn't that kind of communication. So, you know, you're posting and saying, well, this is not good, and you get 50,000 hits, and oh, you see,
Yeah.
is that what? You know, 20
You're
years
making-
ago,
you're making the
you
argument
write a
that
letter,
we-
no one would read it.
Maybe you're making the argument that
So-
maybe we don't need these services, right? Because each of us reads a post, we each make our judgment, and that's good. Because I'll wager that you could look at a tweet and say, that's really good news, and I could look at the same tweet and say, terrible, I won't invest in the company, and that's exactly the right response to goodness, right? I shouldn't be telling you how to respond to a tweet because I've defined this as good and this as bad. So,
But the information that's driving this is financial. If you do this, as your premise is, things will be better.
yeah.
So people say, oh, I want to make
But,
money.
but if it's
let me-"
financial, you can hold it accountable, right?
No,
Yeah?
you're going to the
Yeah.
next step. I'm saying is just communicating things like this to a broad audience, saying, okay, I'll invest in this. I didn't even know this existed.
but
We
wait,
had people
but
at this
wait,
table who
aren't
didn't know
we-
what ESG was.
Aren't we
until 2
getting
weeks
a little
ago.
jaded when everybody tells us how good they are? I mean, I think
not
that's,
them, it's the financial community that's leveraging.
no, but everybody is, right? It's not financial, it's consultants, no. But I think that that's going to be my next part. Is there a financial payoff to being good? And as I said, for something to affect value, I have a very simple proposition. It's called the IT proposition. You know what the IT proposition says? If it does not affect the cash flows in the long term and it does not affect risk, it cannot affect value. What's it? You name it. Control, brand name, great management. So when I first looked at ESG, I said, where is it? Is it showing up as higher growth? Is it showing up as higher margin? Does it mean that companies... So I'm going to go through box by box and look at what I saw reading the evidence. And I'm going to try to be as unbiased as I can about the evidence. And you make your judgment on whether ESG is good for value. Let's start with the growth. Do you think companies that score higher in ESG, no matter what your definition of ESG is, whether it's goodness or risk, that they grow faster? I often ask ESG people to give me an example of a company that benefits from ESG. You know how often Patagonia comes up? Look, that's a company built on goodness. What does Patagonia do? Sell overpriced outerwear to guilty yuppies. Let's be quite clear, right? I mean, this isn't a company. When you put that $400 Patagonia jacket, you can say, look, I'm saving the world. Come on. This is not even beginning to save the world. But when somebody brings up Patagonia, I ask them a question. You know how much revenue Patagonia had last year? You know, not one ESG person who's brought up Patagonia as the answer to that. Anybody want to guess how much revenues Patagonia had last year? About 800 million. So can it afford to play the goodness game? You're playing to a niche community, right? If I take what worked at Patagonia and put it into Nike, $35, $40 billion in revenue selling to every part of the world, I would be in devastating trouble. So I'll make the statement, and I'm willing to be shown wrong on this, that goodness actually puts a cap on growth. That maybe you have to accept the fact that you can grow only so much. Etsy ran into this issue in very practical terms. So those of you remember, Etsy was started as a benefit corporation. You are to benefit corporations, right? The objective is to not just maximize shareholders, so you're going to make the... So as a benefit corporation in 2011, 12, about 2 years into its public existence, it decided to abandon its benefit corporate status. CEO quit. The reason they had to abandon it, they discovered that to stay a benefit corporation, they had to make choices about, do we want to get bigger or do we want to stay at the size we are? And they decided to go bigger. I'm not saying they made the right decision or the wrong decision, but ESG to me puts a cap on growth. It doesn't put a push up on growth. So growth, no. What about margins? This is perhaps the argument you'll often hear. In fact, we have a sustainability group at NYU. They have an entire floor and lots of people in that floor. I don't know what they do, but they actually did know they put out a paper on profitability and ESG. And the paper basically was CFA. They probably had to bring in somebody from the outside to measure margins. And the paper basically shows that higher ESG score companies have higher margins. This is good news, right? And it was actually, at the risk of simplifying the paper, it was basically a regression of margins against ESG scores. Look, the correlation is positive, and I'm going to ask you to run a regression of how much somebody spends at Whole Foods and how wealthy they are. I'm going to make a statement. You know how you get rich? You shop at Whole Foods. Yes, I have a regression to back it up. There's a causation problem here. You don't get rich by shopping at Whole Foods. You shop at Whole Foods because you're rich. So I had a very simple question. I actually wrote to a couple of these researchers and I said, that's interesting that you've shown that correlation. Can you tell me which direction the causation runs? And they said it can't be done. No, it can be done. You know how you do it? You take changes in ESG scores in a year and you look at changes in profitability in subsequent years. And if your case is right, when your ESG scores go up, your profitability should go up. I ran that regression myself. And the correlation is negative to 0. A lot of ESG research is written by advocates, not researchers, and that's a problem. On the reinvestment front, there's almost nothing that I saw in the research, right? Because it depends on the sector. You're an infrastructure company. I don't care whether you're good or bad. You've got to build an airport. You've got to build a damn airport. It might actually cost you more if you want to meet all the ESG constraints. I'm glad as a society that you spent more on it, but spending more can't lead to higher cash flows. It's going to lead to lower cash flows. Which brings me to the risk front. And I'll give you the good news first. There is some evidence that in one sector, and I'm going to focus on the one sector, that there's been a relationship between ESG and cost of capital. You know what that sector is? Energy. And here's why. Over the last decade, we've increasingly pushed away from fossil fuel companies as investors. We got endowment funds too. And when you have fewer people investing in fossil fuel stocks, you're going to push up the required return, which is effectively a higher cost of equity. And we've been very generous with green companies in terms of supplying equity. And don't even get me started on green bonds, because that's an entirely new kettle of fish to open up. But you could argue that in this sector, there's been, but when people, and I heard the Morningstar Sustainalytics person say this, they said, and McKinsey said the same thing in one of their statements, they said, higher ESG scores lead to lower costs of capital. And I said, stop making up crap, because that is crap. At the start of every year, I compute the cost of capital for every single publicly traded company on the face of the earth, 47,000 companies. I could correlate against whatever you want. So if you tell me that big companies have lower cost of capital, I'll run the regression and tell you. And when they said good ESG companies have lower cost of capital, I said, okay, it's a testable proposition. So I took the 47,000 companies, only a subset have ESG scores, right? 3,000, 2,500 companies. And I did a scatter plot, right, of ESG scores against cost of capital. If you're right, the scatter plot should have a downward sloping line. It wasn't even close. In fact, the kinds of companies that ESG has kind of focused on over the last decade tend to be technology companies. In fact, it's a system that's skewed in favor of businesses with intangible assets, right? Because
Why you used only 3,000?
that's the only number. That's the number that I have ESG scores, because I had to get an actual score for a company.
Way more than 3,000.
At least that's all I could find on the Sustainalytics database. Maybe they have more that they don't reveal.
So you use Sustainalytics?
That's what I use.
MSCI, you could have used
I would be glad. You know what? If they give me the scores, I will test it, right?
If you
So
log into a Bloomberg terminal, you can get the ESG scores.
I can't download them for 3,000 companies, right? I mean, I don't have the download capacity. So if they were willing,
You had Bloomberg terminal.
so you think okay. So why don't you send me the ESG scores for whatever service you think is the best service? I will be willing to wager $100 that there's no correlation between ESG scores and cost of capital. I'd be glad to, right? Because I have the cost of capital data, you give me the ESG data, this is a 5-minute job, right? I am not spending money for an ESG score, I'll be quite honest. I don't want to put more gravy in this gravy train than it already has. I'm unwilling to make that investment. But if somebody, I mean, I wrote to all the ESG people and said, send me your scores because you keep claiming the only one that I have access to through NYU Sustainalytics, I used it, and there at least there's no correlation. So the next time somebody tells you companies with high ESG scores have lower costs of capital, tell them, ask them, where are you getting this? What is the basis for this? There's one area where I think you could make the argument that not pushing, because in a sense we think about ESG scores as measuring how much you're pushing the limits of what's acceptable to society on whatever front you want. You could make the argument that companies that walk too close to the line risk walking over the line. Remember Valiant? You know what Valiant did, right? What was its business model? It would buy drugs that were for a small segment of society that had been in patent 10, 11, 12 years. They were seasoned drugs. They would buy the drugs, or the company that owned the drugs, and after they bought them, they would reprice them, which is a nice way of saying they'd increase the price 50-fold. So think of this as Martin Shkreli without the craziness, right? Because if you've heard of Martin Shkreli, that's basically what he did. It's a business model that made a lot of money. But it's a business model that flirted with disaster every day, right? When they were small, nobody noticed. When you become a $100 billion company and you're selling a drug for $5,000 that used to be $50, you are going to end up in the public eye, and they did. And when they did, all kinds of stuff came out about them. The company blew up. The company is now called Bausch & Lomb. It got so toxic that they renamed themselves, lost 90% of the market cap. What's the lesson there? Don't be bad. Don't walk too close to the line. I don't need ESG to tell me this. You're doing it because you got greedy. You're doing this because you don't care about value, you care about next year's earnings. There is this subset of it. There are very few investors who have actually made an ESG. The one small group that might have are activist investors who target companies that walk too close to the line and try to bring them back in line. In fact, since we're getting close to time, let's talk about the link between returns and ESG. So you're welcome to play with this model and say, where does it show up? In fact, I create this, I talked about religion, and I used that, there's this version of ESG where the good go to heaven. High ESG score companies get very little evidence of this. There's a version of ESG where the bad go to hell. A little more evidence of that. There's a version which is actually as a satanic version where the bad actually rule the earth. Right? And there are lots of companies that I look at and say, that company shouldn't have. I mean, Vedanta, an Indian mining company, take a look at its inside and say, now how does a company like this get to the value that it does? And you could argue that telling companies being good is automatically good for value might make you feel good, but the reality is the truth is not just a lot grayer. It could be pushing in the opposite direction. Somebody back there had a question. Yes, go ahead.
So removing the social and governance component and the scores from
Yeah.
the conversation entirely, can't there be an argument made for adopting environmentally conscious practice is meaningful for value creation, whether it be purchasing cheaper renewable energy than cheaper or more expensive fossil
The problem is if it's
fuels?
meaningful for value creation, it would happen, right?
But it is
the-
happening. Businesses are adopting renewable
Well, you're seeing,
energy,
no,
they're
and
decreasing their costs,
it's-
it's improving.
and do you need
market.
so the question is, did you need ESG for that?
That is company to company.
That's but here's what I say. Let's agree that climate change is the existential problem for those of us on the face of the earth. Let's say we all have consensus in this room. Here's my question. Do you want companies to voluntarily decide how they're going to play the climate change game, which is what happens with ESG? Or is this something that we need to do as a society with laws and regulation? The answer is no, it's a no-brainer, right? Because if you let just publicly traded companies with ESG scores have to play the game, you will have what did happen at ExxonMobil, at BHP. It's not like the bad stuff will go away. I'll make a prediction. The fossil fuel business over time is going to get privatized. You're going to end up with privately owned companies. The Sustainalytics can't reach you anymore. You're privately owned. You're not dependent on markets. You don't care whether NYU invests in you, Harvard, because you're no longer an open. I'll make a prediction that that is exactly where you're going to push companies. You're going to push them behind the curtain. And when you look at the publicly traded companies, you're going to feel much better about what you're doing, but the bad stuff is still happening behind the curtain. So if we want to talk about green energy being value creating, let's get real. What are the alternative energy sources? You go outside fossil fuels. Why haven't solar energy and hydro and wind taken off? Because you need the sun to be shining and save the energy. We have a battery. The nature of those energy sources is they can never provide enough energy to keep the globe going, unless we're willing to get rid of our refrigerators and our electrical appliances, which we're very glad to lecture the rest of the world on, right? We're telling the Indians, you know what, you shouldn't be buying a refrigerator. It's bad for the environment. And their reaction is, go jump off a cliff. You've spent 80 years buying whatever you want. Now you're telling us. I mean, it's amazing how much of the ESG prescriptions are coming out of London and New York for the rest of the world. There are 2.5 billion people in India and China. A lot of them are not thinking about climate change. They're thinking about survival through tonight. We need to create a prescription that actually is practical. That's why this Glasgow, Paris, this Davos every year, this kind of dance that we just need to put an end to. Because every time they come out, they put out these completely unrealistic targets. In 10 years, there'll be a 30% reduction in global. Yeah, fine. 10 years later, there was a 3%. We missed a zero. Don't pick on us. They'll put a 40%. Let's get real about what we can do. And that requires that we start. I mean, this is the reason Tariq Fancy used to head BlackRock's sustainability group. And Terence Keeley also used to be, a lot of people are leaving BlackRock to tell the story. Read their stuff, because basically their question is, do you want to trust Jamie Dimon and Larry Fink to be making decisions for society? When those are decisions we need to make, we've in a sense walked away from our own responsibilities, right? In terms of electing people who will make I mean, we can get jaded, that's not going to happen in the US, but that already is a problem. If you've given up on that, the change isn't going to happen. It's just not going to happen with ESG and pushing it on companies and measuring scores. I'm willing to make bets about 10 years from now what will happen. But my side is going to be a very cynical side. There are going to be a lot of people making money on ESG. Companies are going to be doing exactly what they're doing now. We're still going to be 82% dependent on fossil fuels. Climate change is going to be right there, and we're still going to be talking about, no, why aren't companies behaving better? Yes?
So I'm glad you brought up, cynically, ESG is going to keep going. So, you said being good is not good for companies.
I didn't say that. I said being good can be good for some companies.
Right.
It can be neutral for others. It can be bad for other companies, just like any other dimension, right?
But the belief that being good is good for companies.
The belief does nothing for companies, right?
It
Beliefs
does
don't.
something for
Belief has to turn to actions.
It does something for the companies
Like-
that are supplying ESG data.
It does. It creates a business model for that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, just as you use the Business Weekly rating, I'm sure that wasn't good for students trying to find a good college, but it was good for Business Weekly. So if you were going to invest in any of these, would you invest in any of these companies like FTSE, BlackRock, NASDAQ? Because if I'm an
It's a
investor
good
in
question, right? If you want to play a cynical ESG game, the best way to play it is to buy one of the companies that supplies the ecosystem.
Right, because if I'm an investor in BlackRock, I do want people to.
But here's the problem.
think about how-
BlackRock, in a sense, was too big to play this game, right? It's 11 trillion. And when you play this game and the backlash comes, if you want to start an ESG fund, you probably should start it as confined fund without any side costs, because you can't have most of the 11 trillion don't buy into your notion of ESG. So I would say focus. There are some investment funds out there that are far more concentrated on ESG funds. That's all they sell. They don't have very much business. Those would be the funds I invest in. BlackRock, I think, has bought itself a whole host of trouble with this. Today, if you ask Larry Fink, he's probably sorry he ever brought up ESG, right? And it's not just the political backlash, it's the fiduciary issues that are coming up, the kinds of things you can or cannot say as a BlackRock executive. Now, and I think that, but you're right, if you want to make money in this space, go with the people who are selling ESG, not with the people who are buying ESG. Yes?
Stock prices are primarily dependent on demand and supply factors. As ESG investing becomes more and more popular, the flow of funds increase to these ESG compliant companies. So how do companies which are not so ESG compliant, who have robust cash flows and strong businesses, an example would be ITC and tobacco company in India.
Yeah.
How can these companies unlock their true value?
Okay, there are two parts to that. Let me repeat the question. The question was, prices are set by demand and supply. And if people have more demand for companies that are viewed as good companies or high ESG companies, wouldn't their price get pushed up? And your question was, what about the rest of us? No. Have you taken a look at Unilever? It is one of the most laughable examples of trying to force ESG on something that doesn't fit, right? They have an entire 3 pages on helmets. Mayonnaise is good for the world. Come on, guys. It's mayonnaise. It's going to kill you no matter what you describe it as. But that's what's happening. ITC now has an entire section of their annual report where they tell the world, you know what, and you can actually thread the needle. It's amazing how these companies have learned to play the game. The oil companies are getting better and better at this. Their ESG scores keep climbing. Because as I said, it's a gaming model. So by the end of this process, you might see ITC with the highest ESG score of any Indian company because that's all these guys do. I mean, let's face it. When you make all your money off Charminar and that's been your cash cow, you really don't have much to do as a company, right? You're sitting there, what do we do now? Oh, let's spend 15 hours developing a better. There's a huge amount. The Adani report, a third of the report. In fact, I think it's called, in the actual title of their website is Something is Goodness. Right? And this is a company that operates ports and airports. It's infrastructure investment necessary for India. But they issued green bonds. And my question is, how can a company, think about airports, right? What comes in and out of airports? Big aircraft. Think of what big aircraft are among the biggest sources of I mean, I don't care how many carbon offsets you buy and how many trees you put in Oregon. You are creating a carbon footprint that's not fixable. How the heck does a company like that issue green bonds? Tells you less about the company and more about the green and green bonds, right? In fact, I put out a plea, probably not a kind one. I said, I hope there's a default, and I hope it happens just to the green bond holders. I can't think of a group more deserving of default than people holding these green bonds walking around and saying, look how green I am, I own green bonds. Yeah. Yes? No, ESG scores incentivize companies to do the things that will increase their score. So let's be very clear about what ESG scores do. They don't make you do good, they make you do the things that will increase the scores. If that means adding 100 pages of disclosure, that's what you're going to do. If it means selling off your oil business, that's what you're going to do. So let's be very clear. This is not being cynical, this is being real, right?
Okay, so let's say 99%, so if they do good, so it won't affect us. But there's someone out there who's getting benefited from that.
We know exactly who that someone is, right? It's McKinsey providing ESG advice. It's people selling ESG products. It's Morningstar measuring your ESG score. So we don't need to go looking for who's making money. We know exactly who's making money, right?
I meant like the social factors. So they say that they're doing this activity. Let's say they're doing something for women declare of education. It doesn't affect us. But there's someone out there in the world who is getting benefited.
Okay, so you're saying the side things that you do, the kind of glimpses of look how good we are, we're going to help, you know what? Amazon about 4 years ago set aside $500 million into a fund that was supposed to be for nonprofits and charities. You read about the fund? About 2 months ago, they disbanded the fund. You know why? They realized it wasn't making a difference. They said, look, it's going into random places. We can't measure the impact on society. It's different when McKinsey Bezos runs a charitable fund and she says, this is my wealth, I'm giving it out. There's focus. A company runs a fund, God only knows where that focus is going to be today and where it'll be a year from now. So if you're doing something like that on the side, that's, companies do it. And that predates ESG, right? No, that's something that companies have always done. Why do they do it? Sometimes it's for PR, which gives them. Sometimes it's, if you privately own a business, why do you do it? Because you feel like you want to give back to society, right? So I don't have a problem with that. I don't think that is the issue we're talking about. Because then we're talking about tens of millions. We're talking about the hundreds of billions of dollars that are being spent trying to improve ESG scores and asking where's the payoff in that? Yes?
I wanted to switch, I know we're getting
Yeah.
into this at the end. I just want to know what your opinion is of the increasing passive holdings of equities. I read an article the Economist had in 1950 about 80 to 90% of equities were held by individual investors. That's now switched in 2018. I think it's even more, 85%. Do you see any problem with that trend?
It could be, right? The question was about passive investing's rise. And as you all know, in the last 10 years, ETFs and index funds, if you think about the collective money that's invested, are now more than 50% of the markets, right? The active investing portion, whether it's institutional or individual, has dropped below 50%. Why do you think that's happened? Well, the problem is active investing is just a really bad business, right? Remind me again how much the average active portfolio manager beats the market by each year? It's minus 1.5%. It's the strangest business on the face of the earth. The analogy I would like is starting a plumbing business called Floods or Us. And here's what you do. You have a leak in your house, I come and leave a flood, and I insist you pay me. For the longest time, that bad performance, it's always been true. But in the 60s, we invested in a mutual fund. You got a statement once a year, right? It told you what the fund did. You had no comparison. You made 9.3%. You felt pretty good, higher than the CD that you invested in. Today, on your phone, you're checking your fund. You're checking what everybody else is doing. The bad performance has just become visible to everybody invested. So that's the first step. The second is we now have a lot more vehicles if you want to be passive, right? Now, people talk about disruptors. The biggest disruptor in investing was Jack Bogle. Jack Bogle, of course, created the very first index fund. So when I talk to these fintech disruptors, I say, get real. You want to see a real disruptor in action, see what Jack Bogle did. Because you open the index fund, and it started as an S&P 500 index fund. Now you have index funds that pretty much capture everything. You have ETFs. So the combination of revelations about bad performance and the available. So that's what, could there be a consequence? Absolutely. And here's the consequence. Imagine a world where there's only passive investing. First, momentum will become even stronger, right? Because money flows to the largest companies. The larger you get, the more money will flow in. Second, nobody's doing any kind of research anymore because you just buy every company in an index. So there is this nightmare scenario, you'll wake up, but the way I think about markets is they ebb and flow. So as the number of passive investors increases, fewer people are doing research, the chances of you finding screw-ups gets larger. Because in a sense, active investing as it is just too big. It's not finding winners. But maybe we made the business smaller and more focused. So my view is you're going to see passive investing rising, but you're going to hit a point at which there is a payoff to being an active investor. I think it's going to be closer to 75% passive, 25% active, to be quite honest. And the reason is simple. We live in a flatter world. It's a flatter world, right? Everybody has the data, everybody has models, everybody has, so 40 years ago, if you were a New York-based analyst, you already started with an advantage. You had a locational advantage. The SEC office were in New York, and you were in Des Moines. God help you, right? How the heck were you going to get to an SEC filing? Today, the world has flattened out. And this is true, not just in the US, but across markets, which means what active investors bring to the table has become more and more paltry. And I include hedge funds, and I include all the neat stuff. And you know what active investors' hope is, right? What will save them? AI. To which my response is, if everybody has it, nobody has it. Right? It's like SAT scores, right? 40 years ago, you took an SAT, you just walked in and took the damn test. Today, there's an entire infrastructure. And what has it accomplished? It's weaponized the whole process. It's like mutually assured destruction, right? Everybody's prepared, but guess what? You're measured on a relative basis. The SAT scores reflect the fact. And I think with AI, that's what's going to happen. Everybody's going to have AI, but if everybody has AI, the only people who are going to get rich are the people selling the AI stuff, and God help them. No? But if you think this is going to bail out active investing, I think you're barking up the wrong tree. No? Your last two questions, I think we're very close to the idea. Yeah.
So if ESG is not a factor in revenue, operating margin, or anything that grows the cash flow, does that mean that ESG is only a cost factor and it's only going to increase in the future because of improving the disclosure?
If it's a cost factor and it's not doing anything to your risk, then it'll lower your value, right? But if it's enforced by the government, everybody's value will be lower. That's what a regulation or a law does, right? It passes the cost through, environmental regulations. The problem with ESG is it's not across all companies. You know Gresham's law? Bad money drives out good money. You'll have a version of Gresham's law. Bad companies will essentially game the system to essentially win out against good companies. Because good companies will try to follow the little script, right? But bad companies don't feel constrained. Last question.
Professor, do you think the way that the impact of ESG is wrong, rather than like in data you see it doesn't have a direct correlation with growth or other factors, but maybe like it instills a sense of checks and balances. If that metric wasn't there, maybe companies would do a lot.
But then it should show up in some macro number, right? So we should have less fossil fuels being. So I think no matter what path you take, there is an accountability question, right? So if you really believe that ESG is making a difference, then look at the number that you think will make a difference in. And if it doesn't change, then you know what it's telling you, right? People are walking the walk, but they're not, talking the talk, but they're not walking the walk. So is it making companies more conscious of social costs? I have no idea. Is it reducing those social costs? Nothing that I see on the social cost macro fund shows that the costs are decreasing over time. Now,
But there's no research which shows like in the absence of this entire ESG movement.
I mean, but let's face it, much of the focus for the last 14 years, now it's shifted, was on the climate change portion, right? You don't need research. If this was working, then why are we 82% dependent on fossil fuels still, right? I mean, if you read every fossil fuel company, especially publicly traded companies, we should be like at 60%. But we're not. That's why I said it's going behind the curtain, not going away. Yes, Lal.
We didn't get to the end, but you have a suggestion that was an alternative for ESG, and that was something we were mentioning.
How did we invest before ESG came along? Now, did we factor virtue into our decisions? Absolutely, right? I remember 30 years ago, I valued Monsanto. I found it undervalued. I told my wife, should we buy Monsanto? She said, only if you want to get divorced. Because she's an environmentalist to the core, and she felt that Roundup was going to end the world, and she said, you can buy Monsanto, or you can stay married to me. No. And I made my choice, and I'm still married. So through time, we've always, and this is the part that I find troubling about ESG. They seem to think that they invented virtue in 2008. Now, I'll give you a final point. I've known a lot of good people in my life. You know one thing they share in common? They never told me how good they were. Ever. Think about your own experiences. Mother Teresa, I grew up when she was active, or you'd listen to her, I listened to her 4 or 5 times. Never once did I hear her say, look, I am a good person. Because she did good things, right? When you do good things, you don't go, the fact that you need a megaphone to tell the world you're doing good makes me extraordinarily suspicious. Samuel Bankman-Fried. It's very unfair to bring this up. But what is the thing that he talked about? So, amazing, right? He did it for the right reasons.
FTX had a higher ESG score than Economist.
Absolutely. Theranos. What did Elizabeth Hobbs keep talking about? I'm going to make the world a better place by giving away my blood. Do you notice something? Every gigantic scam in history, the front man talks about how much good they're going to do for the world. I am extremely suspicious when a company puts up ESG flags all over the place and talks about how much goodness they do. My question is, what the heck are you hiding? So I know it's not the kind of evidence you can say but keep tabs on scams over time, and you'll get your lifetime of scams if you live long enough. Keep tab on the people who push these scams, and look at how they talk about goodness in society. And you're going to notice a theme. The more talk there is, the more you should worry. So as I said, I wasn't going to hold back, and I don't think I did. But if you find evidence to contradict anything I've said, I'd love to hear it. Right? Because it's ammunition that I will take into account next time I run, because I do these about 4 times a year with every conceivable part of the ESG ecosystem. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to the audience. Thanks very much. I won't insult you by calling you Professor Damodaran. What can we take away from this? Perhaps we all want to exist somewhere between Mother Teresa and Sam Bankman-Fried in terms of the moral impact we make. It's hard to say. Will your slides be available publicly? Since we didn't get all the way through them, are they already available to everyone? So you can see what you missed because there were so many really excellent questions. We didn't get all the way through all the slides. But again, thanks for the great questions and your attention.